A tomato plant on a hot afternoon can look almost painfully polite. The leaves soften a little. The stem leakens just enough to make you wonder if you forgot to water it. Nothing dramatic. No cry, no movement, no obvious struggle. And because it doesn't run or bleed or make a sound we can hear, most of us call that silence. But it isn't silence. In some cases, that plant may already be broadcasting distress through the air in ultrasonic clicks beyond human hearing. Before that, it may have sent chemical warnings into the breeze. Inside its tissues, it may have pushed rapid electrical and calcium signals from one leaf to another, telling the rest of the plant that something is wrong. So when we say plants cry for help, we don't mean they feel pain the way animals do. We mean something older, stranger, and in its own way just as gripping. A rooted organism under threat sends information. Information that can warn its own tissues. Information that can change the behavior of nearby plants, insects, fungi, and maybe even animals listening in. Most of us were taught a simpler story. Plants are alive, of course, but passive. They grow, they flower, they wilt. If something bad happens, they just endure it. And that assumption makes sense because the signs we notice are usually the late signs. Yellowing leaves, browning edges, a drooping stem, visible damage. But visible damage is often the last chapter, not the first. The real story starts much earlier, at a scale and in a language human senses usually miss. And once you understand that, a houseplant on the windowsill, a lawn after mowing, or a tree on a dry street no longer looks like background scenery. It looks like a living system constantly measuring risk, making trade-offs, and sending signals to survive. One of the most arresting examples came from researchers at Tel Aviv University, including Lilach Hadani and Yossi Yovel, in a study published in 2023. They recorded tomato and tobacco plants and found that stressed plants emitted airborne ultrasonic sounds, especially when they were dehydrated or had been cut. Healthy plants made far fewer. Not songs, not little voices, more like tiny clicks or pops. These sounds were outside the range of human hearing, but not outside the range of many animals. Mice can hear there, some insects can hear there. Bats definitely can. And the sounds weren't random enough to be meaningless noise. Using machine learning, the researchers could distinguish between a thirsty plant and a cut plant based on the sound patterns alone. That matters because it means the plant's condition was physically detectable in the air before a person would necessarily notice anything dramatic. The likely cause is something called cavitation. Here's the simple version. Plants pull water upward through tubes called xylem. It's a remarkable hydraulic system, and it works under tension. When a plant gets too dry, or when tissue is cut, tiny air bubbles can form and disrupt that water column. Those failures create vibrations. Imagine a straw starting to suck air, but on a microscopic level, deep inside living tissue. The plant's plumbing begins to crackle. Now, you could say, hold on. If that sound is just a byproduct of stress in the plumbing, is it really a cry for help? That's exactly the right question, because in biology, not every signal is intentional in the human sense. Smoke from a fire is not trying to communicate, but it still tells the forest something important. Blood in water is not a sentence, but predators understand it. Information changes behavior, whether it was meant to or not. So, even if some plant sounds begin as a physical consequence of stress, they may still matter ecologically. Other organisms may detect them. Scientists are actively exploring that possibility. Nature does not require a voice box for information to become powerful. And sound is only one layer. Inside the plant, a threat can spread as a rapid internal message. If an insect starts chewing a leaf, the bitten leaf doesn't just sit there and take it. Research by Masatsugu Toyota, Simon Gilroy, Idi and colleagues, published in Science in 2018, showed that wounding can trigger fast calcium waves moving through the plant. Earlier, work from researchers like Edward Farmer also helped reveal long-distance electrical signaling after damage. Translated into ordinary language, one part of a plant can warn another part that an attack is happening. That warning sets off chemistry. Defense hormones, such as jasmonates, rise. The plant shifts resources. It may make tissue less tasty. It may produce compounds that interfere with digestion. It may slow growth in order to survive. In other words, a leaf under attack can cause a whole body response. That is a profound reframe. What looks still from the outside is not inactive on the inside. The plant is not doing nothing. It is detecting, transmitting, prioritizing, and responding. No neurons, no brain. But definitely not nothing. And then there's the part many of us have already smelled without realizing what it was: fresh-cut grass. For most people, that smell means summer, lawns, warm evenings, a clean, green kind of nostalgia. But scientifically, that scent is also a wound response. When plant tissues are damaged, they release a burst of compounds called green leaf volatiles. Those chemicals are part of the sharp smell we associate with cut grass, torn leaves, and crushed herbs. To us, it smells fresh. To the plant world, it can mean danger. Researchers, including Richard Carbon at UC Davis, have shown that plants can respond to volatile cues released by damaged neighbors. In some systems, exposure to those airborne chemicals can prime defenses, and making nearby plants harder to eat or quicker to react when their own turn comes. So the next time you smell cut grass, it helps to know what you're actually smelling. Not tragedy in a cartoonish sense, not screaming as a cheap metaphor, but the chemistry of injury, the first molecular haze of damage control and warning. That simple reframe changes everything. A smell we filed under pleasant background suddenly becomes information from a living organism trying to manage harm. And some plants go even further than warning. They recruit help. This is where cry for help becomes surprisingly literal. Work pioneered by researchers such as Marcel Dicke and others showed that when certain plants are attacked by herbivores, they release blends of airborne chemicals that attract the natural enemies of those herbivores. A plant being eaten by caterpillars can emit a chemical profile that helps parasitic wasps find the caterpillars. A spider mite-infested plant can become more attractive to predatory mites. That is not passive suffering. That is strategy. The plant cannot run from the attacker, so it alters the behavior of the ecosystem around it. It changes the air. It turns its damage into a message. And if the right ally is nearby, the attacker may suddenly become the hunted. Once you see that, the emotional story shifts. We often mistake rootedness for helplessness. But being unable to flee does not mean being unaware. It means survival depends on sensing more, not less. And the signaling doesn't stop above ground. Below the soil, roots release chemicals into an environment that is crowded, competitive, and deeply social in the biological sense. Roots can detect gradients of water, nutrients, salts, microbes, and signals from neighboring plants. In some experimental systems, plants connected by common mycorrhizal fungal networks have shown changes in defense responses after one of them is attacked, suggesting that underground links can help transmit warning-related information. This area of science is complex, and it's easy to oversimplify it into fantasy. Plants are not chatting underground like humans at a dinner table, but neither are they isolated objects in pots, each living alone in mute independence. They exist in dense webs of exchange, influence, and response. Even more striking, plants can be sensitive to vibration. Researchers Heidi Appel and Rex Cockcroft at the University of Missouri found that plants exposed to the vibrations of caterpillar chewing change their defense chemistry. The plant didn't need a brain to recognize a meaningful pattern. It needed a body capable of detecting the physical signature of danger. And that may be the deepest point in all of this. We keep looking for intelligence in forms that resemble us. A face, a voice, a nervous system, fast movement. But plants evolved another path. They spread their sensing across tissues. They turned their whole bodies into monitoring systems. They integrate light, gravity, touch, moisture, temperature, microbes, injury, and chemical cues from other organisms. Then they alter growth, chemistry, timing, and resource use in response. A plant is less like a statue and more like a living network. Not conscious in the human sense, not emotional in the way we are emotional, but exquisitely responsive, relentlessly observant, always negotiating with the world. That's why the visible signs we notice can be misleading. By the time a leaf hangs limp, the invisible emergency may have been underway for hours or days. Tiny pores on the leaf surface, called stomata, may already have closed to reduce water loss. Hormones may already have shifted from growth to defense. The hydraulic system may already be under dangerous strain. Chemical messages may already be in the air. The plant may have been trying to cope long before it looked sick enough for us to care. And there's a warning in that, not just for houseplants, but for ecosystems. When drought deepens, when heat spikes, when insects arrive out of season, when soils lose microbial diversity, the silent signaling life of plants changes. Stress doesn't stay local for long. It ripples through food webs. A thirsty plant is not only a thirsty plant. It may become more vulnerable to pests. It may change the scents pollinators encounter. It may alter what herbivores eat, what predators hunt, and how neighboring plants prepare. In agriculture, scientists are already interested in whether plant sounds or stress chemicals could help detect trouble earlier, before crop damage becomes obvious. In forests and wild landscapes, the stakes are even broader. If we only pay attention, once leaves brown and branches die back, we are arriving late to a conversation that started much sooner. And maybe that is part of why this subject lands so hard emotionally. Plants have always been performing this hidden labor of survival right in front of us. We just haven't been very good at noticing it. We call them decorative. We call them scenery. We put them in the background of our lives because they move on timescales, and in channels our bodies are not tuned to read. But slow is not simple. Silent is not empty. Still is not the same as unaware. A wilted basil plant on a kitchen sill is not just failing. A tree releasing stress chemistry in dry heat is not just standing there. A field after mowing is not just a smell. Again and again, what looks passive turns out to be active. What looks random turns out to be informative. What looks insignificant turns out to be the visible edge of a much deeper system. So, when a plant cries for help, the real revelation is not that it sounds like us. It's that life found another way to sense danger without nerves, another way to warn without a voice, another way to influence the world without taking a single step. And once you understand that, ordinary moments stop being ordinary. The droop of a stem, the sharp smell of broken leaves, the strange resilience of a weed pushing through concrete. These are no longer background details. They are signs of a living organism engaged in constant, sophisticated survival. The plant was never just sitting there. It was listening. It was signaling. It was trying. If there's a plant moment you'll never look at the same way again, tell me in the comments. Maybe it's the smell of cut grass, a houseplant that seemed to collapse overnight, or a tree outside your window that suddenly feels less like scenery and more like a neighbor with a hidden language. And if you want more science that makes the ordinary world feel deeper, subscribe. Because the more closely we look at plants, the less silent the living world becomes.